Hey everybody, what's going on? It was another big week of action for the Montreal Canadiens. There's plenty to dive into in this video, whether it's the goaltending that the Montreal Canadiens have been getting from Samuel Montembeault or the upcoming trade deadline that is just over a month away in the NHL. There's plenty to look at here in terms of what to expect from the Habs and which pieces they may consider moving ahead of that deadline. It's become very clear over the last 2 months and even entering the season that the Montreal Canadiens would be sellers ahead of the trade deadline in March, and there's plenty of reason to back that theory right now, especially when you consider some of the UFAs that the Habs boast on their roster, whether that's Sean Monahan, Evgeny Dadonov, Jonathan Drouin. Maybe the latter two won't get the returns exactly what you might have expected entering the season, but they're still going to be likely moved ahead of the deadline. But it's also a very flat cap environment right now in the NHL, and that makes it difficult to move players and their salaries, especially ones over the $5 million mark, like a Jonathan Drouin or an Evgeny Dadonov. Even Sean Monahan makes over that amount, but the Habs should be able to retain on his contract to be able to maximize it. The biggest issue right now in terms of Monahan is that he's not currently in the lineup, and he hasn't been for a while, which is kind of disappointing when you consider the start that he got off to in the regular season, with the points he was putting up, the impact he was having on the power play and the penalty kill, and just his overall presence on this Habs team. That's been a cause for concern right now that he's not playing and he's currently on the injured list, but he is skating and he is closing in on a return. But you're obviously going to want him to get up to speed so that teams can really see the value that he can bring to the table down the stretch and really help them in the postseason, whether that's a Colorado Avalanche, the Pittsburgh Penguins. Teams like that should be looking for a center like Sean Monahan. It just really depends on the price that they're willing to pay. Had he been able to stay healthy for the majority of this season, you likely could have expected a first-round pick in return for Monahan, even if it was unsure whether that would be a 2023 first or a 2024 first. But the Montreal Canadiens are undoubtedly looking for first-round picks in exchange for Monahan, and I'm not quite sure whether that's realistic anymore to get for him. I think you're likely expecting a similar return to the one they got for Artturi Lehkonen last season, whether that's a second-round pick and a top prospect, or just a second-round pick and someone that can potentially be a top 6 forward or a top 4 defenseman on the back end. I think that's completely reasonable to expect in return for Monahan. I think even if he does come back sooner rather than later, he'll be able to reestablish his value and really get back to being the player he started his tenure with as a Montreal Canadien. Then, of course, you have to factor in players that still have term left on their deals. Joel Edmondson still has 1 year remaining on his contract after this season, while Josh Anderson still has a few after signing a long-term deal with the Montreal Canadiens when he was acquired from the Columbus Blue Jackets. Those are two players that are certainly receiving phone calls for Kent Hughes and Jeff Gordon, and they're the ones that are most likely to be moved ahead of the deadline. If you're looking at just pieces on this roster that make sense in terms of where the Canadiens are at right now, I'd say Anderson is a bit less likely because although there's a lot of interest in him, you're not quite sure if you want to move a player like him, because when the time does come for the Montreal Canadiens to be in their competitive window, you're likely going to be looking for a player of his style, so it could make sense to keep him around. You just can't move all the veterans in this lineup, and Anderson could be a piece that they look to keep in the long run. But Edmondson would be a smart idea to move him right now when you can. This is a guy that can fetch a return, assuming he can kind of get back into his little bit of a rhythm of late. He's been struggling during his tenure with the Montreal Canadiens this season, whether that's a carryover due to injuries or just really a lack of mobility right now that he's finding himself having on the back end. Edmondson certainly has some value that is worthwhile of moving his contract right now. The Edmonton Oilers appear to be a prime destination for Edmondson, and you can see them making a silly move to acquire him and likely overpaying. So I think that's a spot where Joel Edmondson would fit in nicely, even if he's not exactly the type of defenseman that this current club needs. That's it for me today from Cook's Corner. As always, let me know in the comments section down below your thoughts on some of the pieces that the Montreal Canadiens could be looking to move ahead of the NHL's trade deadline in March. I'm Zach Cook. We'll see you later.